Welcome to the office of the Communist Party of Great Britain Marxist-Leninist in Birmingham. Thanks for coming. We've organised this meeting today on the topic of imperialism and war, with a specific focus on what's taking place at the minute in the Ukraine following the fascist coup. And so for us, it's important that we understand that if our government plans to make war with other states, that we need to work for the defeat of our own government in any such war and bring about a revolution. Now, the talk that we've organised today is on this question of imperialism and war.
Thank you, Comrade Chairman. Thank you all for coming to listen to me, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you to the Midland region of our party for this invitation. I apologise to those who might have listened to me on this subject in Liverpool, because you'd be bored. It's like listening to the same lesson in your class again. And if that happens, just go out and take a little walk, or just go to sleep. You need it. You work hard. I hope that my conversation with you today would not be academic. There is a purpose to this talk. There is a practical reason behind this talk. We're not discussing theoretically the question of war. Of course, the theory does come into it. And the question of war is very important. Not only is it important theoretically, what is war, why is it waged, who wages it, etc., but it's also practical importance because there is war everywhere around us. And the two clips that you so kindly arranged to show us here give a very good context as to the world we are living in. Ukraine was a wonderful place. It was a part of the Soviet Union. It was a prosperous place. It produced, in its Soviet days, a quarter of the entire food production of the Soviet Union. It was a heavily industrialized state, and the eastern part of Ukraine is still heavily industrialized and is reliant on the market in Russia now for its existence. It's Russian-speaking, and but when the Soviet Union collapsed, we cannot go into the reasons for the collapse of the Soviet Union. Basically, Khrushchev revisionism gutted the Soviet Union, and over a period of 3.5 decades it collapsed. But when it collapsed, Ukraine became an independent country after 300 years of being part of, if you like, Russia and then the Soviet Union. Now, at the time of the separation of Ukraine and of many other constituents of the former Soviet Union, it was an agreement between the United States of America and NATO on one side and Russia on the other that NATO will not expand into the territories of the former Eastern Bloc countries, let alone the former constituents of the USSR. That agreement was honored and breached, and one after the other, the East European countries, as well as many republics of the former Soviet Union, the Baltic republics, etc., were taken into NATO. Then NATO decided to enlarge itself into Georgia and Ukraine, and that is when the Russians, after they got rid of the drunken administration of Yeltsin, said no, this far and no further. There was a war in Georgia in 2008, and the Georgian little fascist puppets of US imperialism and NATO got a bloody nose. And that should have been a lesson. But of course, it's not a question of logic, it's not a question of intelligence. Imperialism does not change its tack. It will continue to be what it has always been, and it will try again, fail again, try again, till it's finally crushed by revolutionary movements everywhere. So they have decided to go ahead and incorporate Ukraine first into the European Union and then into NATO. And this is not something that is acceptable to Russia. And it's not acceptable to the people of Ukraine either. Certainly not in the eastern part of the country, but although you don't hear about it, there are many people in the western part of the country who do not want to be part of the European Union, who do not want to be part of NATO. Now, because there was an administration that did not sign the association agreement with the European Union, the Americans and their puppets organized basically a coup, which Paul rightly described as a fascist coup. Got rid of Yanukovych, and as soon as they got rid of it, they started taking measures which certainly were not greeted with glee in the eastern part of Ukraine, and also among some sections of the population in the western part. So people got fed up. They would not recognize this illegitimate regime, and they therefore started occupying one town after another, administration, etc. And there have been massacres that have been committed in the southern city of Odessa. There have been massacres in Mariupol, and there have been people killed in Lugansk. There have been people killed in Slavyansk, etc. So the purpose of making this little introduction is to say imperialism means war, and we've got to understand what exactly is the reason behind it. Lenin said that people forget that the fundamental question of the class character of the war, why the war broke out, the classes that are waging it, the historical and historico-economic conditions that give rise to it. There's a lot of futile discussion about war, and always ends up people quarreling and generating a lot of heat but very little light. And what happens all the time is people say, oh, who started it? Who began it? It's not a question of who started it. You've got to ask the question of why the war started. And this cannot be done unless and until you look at the class character of the war. War is not something which is unrelated to peaceful development and times of peaceful development. As Lenin constantly pointed out, emphasizing the phrase of Clausewitz, one of the most famous military writers, a German, who said war is a continuation of policy by other, more violent means. War is not something different from the policy that the classes waging wars pursued prior to the war. It's just that by so-called peaceful means they could not attain their purposes. In the end, they came to blows. And they came to blows, and you've got to ask yourself, what were the economic reasons that they came to blows? What was the policy these parties were pursuing prior to the war? What exactly is the class that rules the country that is waging the war? Unless and until you can do that, it's not really possible for you to understand what that war is about, and it's not possible for you to take a correct attitude towards war. If the purpose of the war is to throw alien oppression and to fight against an oppressive invading power, then it is a liberation war, and it is capable of being supported. If, on the other hand, the purpose of the war is redivision, plunder, pillage, and booty, it's a reactionary war, and it's not a war we can support. But if the war on both sides is exactly the same, both sides are trying to redivide the world, plunder the world, pillage the world, and gain the maximum booty at the expense of the other, then it's a war which is reactionary on both sides, like the first imperialist World War was, and like the Second World War was before the Soviet Union joined it. Now, we communists says war is inevitable as capitalism lasts, and people think we're Jehovah's Witnesses, who say the world is going to come to an end, and they give a date, and the date passes and the world doesn't come to an end. We happily carry on doing whatever we are doing. And so they tell us that, no, it's not true. War is not something that is connected with capitalism. We can abolish war without abolishing capitalism. Lenin made the profound observation, which is that it's beyond doubt that capitalism's transition to the stage of monopoly capitalism to finance capital is connected with the intensification of the struggle for partitioning the world. When we say war is inevitable, what exactly is the reason for that? First of all, I think there has always been war as long as there's been capitalism. But it becomes much more fierce. It turns into world wars all the time, from time to time, because of the conditions that monopoly capitalism has brought. Before the Berlin Congress at the end of the 19th century, there were large areas of the world that were unoccupied. It doesn't mean that local inhabitants did not live there. It's like America going to an empty country in the New World. It wasn't an empty country. It was not a country that was occupied by Europeans. There were parts of the world that no imperialist or colonialist world occupied. So they could sit around a table, slightly bigger than this because these statesmen meet around very grandiose tables, much better the chairs than you're sitting on.
They don't have a snooker table underneath them.
They have a snooker table. That's more important to them than a table. Right? So they sat around, and the statesmen simply drew lines on the map of basically Africa. It's known as the scramble of Africa, even among the bourgeois historians, and saying this belongs to that, this belongs to that. Tiny little Belgium got the whole of Congo, a country or a territory rich in every kind of mineral. That's been the curse of Congo. The only fault that the Congolese have committed is they are sitting on a very rich territory, rich with minerals of every kind. Various other countries got, Germany got some, and the biggest two thieves got the most. That's France and Britain. Britain, the chief thief, got the most. So they divided the world. But once that had happened, there were no unoccupied worlds that could be peacefully negotiated and divided between the powers. From then on, there could only be redivision. Now, Germany, in the 1880s, was not so powerful. It was an upcoming power, it was building its industrial might. But by the turn of the century, at the beginning of the 20th century, Germany felt cheated. According to the logic of the exploiters and the bandits, it felt it had not got its fair share of the slaves, booty, and colonies and everything. It wanted to change the world. How do you change the world? It could only be done at the expense of Britain and France. And Britain and France's answer was, but this is ours by law. It's our territory, it's not yours. As Lenin put it, imperialist Germany had come to the banqueting table too late when all the seats around it had been occupied. So if all the seats are occupied, if they're all comrades and friends, you say, oh come on, you come from London, we've been sitting here, come on, you take our chairs and we'll hang around in the corner somewhere. But this is not how it happened in the world of capitalist exploiters. They could only occupy the chair by knocking somebody off the chair that they've been occupying before. And that, in the world of capital, in the final analysis, is decided by a war, and in the case of the First World War, a world war, where two coalitions range each other for industrial scale slaughter. It was the first war where capitalist organization, capitalist industrial development seamlessly combined with each other to make for the maximum kind of butchery. This First World War is seared in British memory very much because Britain lost more in that war than in any other war. Britain lost close to 1 million of its own soldiers, 887 or something, but it lost also, which didn't really count very much, about 1 million colonial slaves, mainly from India, but also from Ireland and also from other places. So, as Lenin said, who was to prevent Germany from claiming? A young, robust, virile robber has arrived, and he's telling the old, decrepit, bandits, gorging at the feast, saying your time has come and you must go. Of course they won't go. And that is precisely what war is inevitable, because under the conditions of imperialism, when there are no unoccupied of the world, then the fight for territories, for colonies, for spheres of influence, for avenues of investment, and for sources of raw materials and markets is an ever-growing one. So although since the end of the Second World War, we didn't have a world war, but there has been no year in which peace has prevailed. As soon as the First World War had ended, you had the war in Korea. As soon as that finishes, there's the war in Indochina. As soon as this is finished, there are wars in Middle East. And since the Second World War, this tiny country, Britain, has intervened abroad on at least 130 occasions. Can you believe it? And no wonder the chiefs of staff are saying, we cannot possibly reduce our army anymore. It goes against our traditions not to project our power internationally. That's a euphemism for saying we have always committed aggression, we've always looted, and what a shame it would be to give up the tradition of looting and committing aggression against other people. That's really what they're trying to say. But of course they don't speak that language, because even the most dim-witted worker would be able to understand that this is not quite right, because workers are not in favor of going around and looting other people. If you tell them, we're going to go to South Africa to loot them, a lot of people would say, no, I don't really think one. But when you go and say you want to save democracy, you want to save human rights, there are these people who are cannibalizing, they're doing this and the other, then of course the average idiot who is ignorant goes along with it. So there's no question that imperialism makes for war. It's the way it works. And precisely because it makes for war, because it seeks monopoly in the sphere of economics, in the sphere of politics, and in the sphere of diplomacy, finance capital, quite rightly, as Lenin says after Hilferding, seeks domination. That is the substance of imperialist policy, both in its home policy and in its policy abroad. I mean, people don't feel the same pinch in the imperialist countries because things are relatively still better compared with what happens in the poor, impoverished countries. But in the final analysis, imperialism is not into democracy. 2 million people can stage a walk and a demonstration in Hyde Park Corner against the then impending Iraq war. Does anybody take notice of them? Of course not. It's a democratic country. You have the right to demonstrate, and of course the British government, the ruling class, has the democratic right to be sending its aeroplanes over the heads of the people who are demonstrating and beginning to bomb Iraq. Let nobody get the impression, as Paul said in his introduction, that we communists are pacifists and we are opposed to all war. We're not opposed to all war. We recognize certain wars which are legitimate. To name those legitimate wars, wars of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie are legitimate, and we support them. Secondly, wars of national liberation against imperialism and colonialism are legitimate wars, and we support them. Thirdly, the wars of the rising even bourgeois forces against absolutism, medievalism and feudalism are just wars. They are progressive wars in history, and we support them. And finally, the wars of victorious socialism against reactionary states, as for example the war of intervention against the young Soviet Republic at the end of following the October Revolution, and of course the Great Patriotic War of the Soviet Union during the Second World War. We supported the position of the Soviet Union, or had we been there, we would have supported that position. Take them one by one. Wars of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie. Now this is something that revisionists don't like to mention, because their idea is always peaceful development of society. We will vote a Labour government into power, and the communists will be giving them the guidance, and they will then enact a socialist program, and they'll pass a bill in Parliament, and everything will be fine. The monarchy will disappear from the scene, or we will have maybe a socialist queen who signs all the bills that we present. The armed forces will accept it, the chief of the general staff would accept it, and the bourgeoisie will accept it. They'll say, well, we've been ruling for 350 years, our time has come really, since the English Revolution of 1648, when the bourgeoisie basically begins to come to power. We have had good time, and now it's the time of the next class, and everything will be fine. We would not have to raise our hands, because we're not allowed to discipline our children, let alone beat adults up, and this is something just not done. But Lenin answers this by saying that anyone who accepts the class struggle cannot fail to accept civil wars, which in every class society are the natural and under certain conditions inevitable continuation, development and intensification of class struggle. That has been confirmed by every great revolution. To repudiate civil war and to forget about it is to fall into extreme opportunism and renounce the socialist revolution. So we certainly in our party do not renounce the idea that it will be necessary in the final analysis to wage a civil war against the bourgeoisie, and that is a war that every worker must support. That's about the only war that's worth fighting for in the centers of imperialism. Any other war is not worth fighting for. Of course, it goes against the Trotskyite and subsequently the Khrushchevite tradition of peaceful development revolutions. Peaceful development of revolution, nobody would exclude the possibility of it, but is a very, very rare phenomenon. And even when the working class almost comes to power peacefully, the other side will not let go. The Russian Revolution in its beginning stage was almost peaceful. The Bolsheviks, with the help of the Soviets, took power. And then what happens? Hell broke loose out. The White Russians, the reactionary generals, supported by Britain, France, and 12 other countries, waged a combination of civil war and war of intervention. And it cost something like over 6 million lives. All of them are attributed to Stalin. He killed, he killed every Russian. There was nobody left. He was the only one living in Kremlin at the end of the Second World War. Right? So anybody who has been killed any time since the October Revolution is always, the death is always attributed to really Stalin. It's becoming ludicrous that, they talk about the Katyn massacre and being committed by Soviet soldiers. There is no historical evidence. It's on the contrary committed by the Nazis. Everybody knows it. Even if Putin has accepted that it's committed by the Soviet Union, this is just not true. Then, to commemorate that event, there was a whole plane load of reactionary general staff from Poland and the high officials, including the Prime Minister of the Polish government and the President, going to Smolensk. And the plane crashed. And they all died. And somebody said to me, who arranged that? I said, Stalin, of course. And said, but he's been dead for quite some time. I said, Stalin has that ability. He can arrange that even if he's been dead for some. Because the only way to actually answer ridiculous people is to make an outrageously ridiculous statement yourself, and they can see the absurdity of it all. So they will continue to do that. As far as the second war that we justify is wars of liberation. There are people who are subjugated by the system of colonialism, by the system of imperialism, and they're everywhere fighting to free themselves from the clutches of imperialism, from the clutches of finance capital. Be they in Palestine, be they in Iraq, be they somewhere else. And imperialism is trying to oppress them. And in the circumstances, we have a duty to support the national liberation movement. There are plenty of people in the imperialist countries who, on one excuse or the other, refuse to support these wars of liberation. There are some go halfway through. They want to see the defeat of imperialist forces, but they don't want to say victory to the ones against whom the war is being waged. Take the case of example. It's a slightly touchy question with some people. How can you say victory to Saddam Hussein when Iraq was being invaded? Well, instead of arguing with these people myself, because they call themselves Marxist-Leninists, I answer them in the following words of Lenin. In the case of such wars between imperialism and oppressed nations, socialists everywhere, especially socialists belonging to the imperialist countries, would be duty-bound to support the struggle of the oppressed against imperialism. For these would be just and defensive wars on the part of the oppressed nations, irrespective of who would be the first to attack. Any socialist would wish the oppressed, dependent and unequal states victory over the oppressor, slave-holding and predatory great powers. Well, I would have thought that was perfectly clear. And Lenin sums that up by saying the revolutionary movement in the advanced countries would actually be a sheer fraud if in their struggle against capital the workers of Europe and America were not closely and completely united with hundreds of millions of colonial slaves who are oppressed by capital. It is our duty to do so. It's not something we do out of humanitarianism. It's not like you support a cat that is neglected and you phone the RSPCA and say, well, this cat is being maltreated, can you take? Yes, of course we are motivated by considerations of humanitarianism. We communists, whatever people accuse us of, are not lacking in humanity and humanitarianism. We are not lacking in concern for fellow human beings. But that's not the main reason. The main reason is no nation can be free if it oppresses another nation. If we allow our ruling class to oppress and rob other people, we're creating a rod for our own back. It's inviting them to do the same to us. They divide people who are opposed to imperialism into oppressing nations and oppressed nations, and we must therefore be in the business of supporting the oppressed, and we must be in the business of making sure our ruling class is not able to mischief make abroad. In the olden days, when the Communist Party of Great Britain was a revolutionary party, and it was one of the small, a very, very good party. We in our party want to revive and maintain those traditions. The leaders of the Communist Party used to say, our ruling class is only able to cause mayhem, war, damage, desolation and destruction because we are not giving it enough trouble at home. If we were keeping them busy here, that they had to worry about what the British working class is doing, they wouldn't be able to wage war. Without our support, they cannot make munitions, they cannot send soldiers, they cannot maintain supplies, they cannot print the newspapers, they cannot send their anchormen to tell lies on television 24/7. We can stop that, but we can only do that if we understand that it is in our interest to support the national liberation struggle of the oppressed people, be they in Iraq, be they in Palestine, be they in Syria, or be they in Libya. I mean, we had left-wing people holding demonstrations. Stop the War Coalition in this country holding a demonstration outside the Libyan embassy during the time that imperialism is threatening the very existence of Libya. And sadly, they were able to do it successfully. They haven't got the benefits of it because Libya is now unruly. Libya is a place which is ruled not by any government, but it's controlled by different armed militias in different areas. In the so-called center of revolution, in Benghazi, they killed the American ambassador. Yeah? It's a just punishment as far as I'm concerned. That's what the Americans deserve, what they've done to Libya. They murder the head of the state. They treat him like a mad animal, and they wreck that country, which is a beautiful country. I have seen that country. It was worth visiting, and people had wonderful lives. They had a per capita income of more than $15,000 a year, which is not a small thing for an African country. Everybody had a house. Everybody had a car. That is, if having a car is a piece of good fortune. Everybody had a car. Everybody had a telephone. Everybody could study up to any level at state expense, and if that education was not available in Libya, they would be sent at state expense to some foreign country. Everybody could have any treatment. If Libyan hospitals could not treat a particular disease, they could be sent at state expense abroad. Libya was a wonderful place, and what's more, they were helping fellow African countries, and they were providing a lot of shelter for black Libyans who were treated with contempt and arrogance by the non-black section of the population. It's only a country of small 6 million people, but it's a vast country, again rich in resources. So we have a duty to support the national liberation movement. The third type of war we just support is the wars waged by people to free themselves of absolutism. Europe had its wars against absolutism. You know, English Civil War of 17th century. We had that. France had it in the late 18th century, 1789 onwards. And many European countries, Germany and Italy in 1871, etc. These were wars of the rising bourgeoisie against absolutism. These were wars that anybody would have supported. And today, of course, similar wars are beginning to be waged against reactionary absolutist regimes like Saudi Arabia, like Qatar, like Kuwait, and other, like Bahrain, and places of that nature, which are the darlings of imperialism. And Lenin quite rightly pointed out, it was clear to him 100 years ago, but it's even more clear to us. He said a most striking example of the decay of the entire European, and we might add the American, bourgeoisie can scarcely be cited than the support it's lending to reaction in Asia for the sake of selfish aims of financial manipulators and capitalist swindlers. That, of course, was said probably in regard to China and Turkey and Iran. But today you can see, I mean, Blair was making a statement the other day. He said, unpalatable though it is, we may have to come to terms with the Assad regime. And he said it is because we want to fight against Islamist jihadis. He mentioned all kinds of places where there are Islamic jihadis, but in that narrative of in favor of democracy, he did not mention Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
Now, Saudi Arabia is financing jihadists all over the place and sending them from Afghanistan to begin with, to Syria, to Iraq, and many other places. Because not only does British imperialism rely a lot on Saudi oil and sale of arms to the Saudi regime to the tune of tens of billions of pounds, but Blair himself is one of the consultants. This person of very modest means in terms of his family background, having left the job of the prime ministership, is now sitting on an empire growing on a daily basis, which is estimated unofficially at 100 million. Now you may think it's small change, but I think it's a fairly large sum of money. And he obviously thinks it's small change because he's considering on expending it more and more. And he is advisor to all kinds of governments, etc. Which he of course would not mention his diatribes about democracy. But we support these struggles, and it would be lovely if the Saudi Arabian regime was to be thrown by a Colonel Gaddafi kind of figure. And don't believe that there's no opposition in Saudi Arabia. Don't believe that there are not nationalist-minded officers in the Saudi army. They might be kowtowing to the king today and, wearing the traditional Arab clothing, but they're burning with anger and hatred that their country is being looted by imperialism and the 10,000 princes. And they would make short work of them, and it would be a wonderful day. I will hold a party if that happens. You must come to it. And then, of course, the wars of victorious socialism against the surrounding reactionary states. As Lenin pointed out again and again, socialism cannot be victorious simultaneously in all countries. This must create friction and a striving on the part of the bourgeoisie of other countries to crush the victorious proletariat of the socialist country. In such a case, the war of the proletariat of the socialist country would be a war for socialism and liberation of nations from the bourgeoisie. And that would be a war that we would obviously support, like the war of the Soviets against intervention and the great patriotic war of the Soviet people. And likewise, if any of the remaining socialist countries were to be imposed by imperialism, and it is my party's view, the countries like Vietnam, Cuba, China, DPRK are socialist countries. Whatever your differences on those, any one of them with us, we would support those countries against imperialism's attack. We unashamedly say that. We are not saying this in a hush-hush type in quiet corners. It is our open policies. And we continue to insist that the anti-war movement, if it wants to be a truly anti-war movement, it must support the struggles of the socialist countries. It must support the struggles of people against absolutism. It must support the national liberation struggles. And when they do not do that, the anti-war movement actually becomes an instrument for propagation and carrying out of war by imperialism. That's what stopped the war coalition in this country. It's really amazing the capacity of the British bourgeoisie to have control over both ends. It wages war, it has control over the war machine. It controls the anti-war movement. So the anti-war movement is actually a movement, and as the elections come nearer, it trims its sails to suit the electoral needs of social democracy. It actually turns itself into an organ for actually re-electing a Labour government committed to socialism. Now, I have said it many times. If you've tried to marry somebody for 70 years and they keep on saying no, is it not time for you to stop making the attempt to get them to change their mind? Labour Party will not do socialism. Labour Party does not do socialism. It didn't do socialism even in its earlier days, when there might have been some hope, there might have been some illusion on the part of the working people that it will bring socialism. Today, it's not even in favor of wage rises for the working class. Forget about socialism. Forget about the Labour Party. The trade union leadership is not actually able to represent the collective needs of the working class. It basically, the leadership of the trade unions tries to act as the chief executive officers that they wish to be. They sit in big offices, spending huge amount of their time with their investment advisors as to how the large sums of the trade unions are to be invested. The membership is declining. Over the last 20 years, the membership of trade unions has come down from 14 million to about 7 million. But the income hasn't gone down. The membership has come down, the rates of membership have gone up, the income is used basically for the purposes of supporting the Labour Party, for keeping a whole huge well-paid bureaucracy, providing them with cars. Every now and then you get some scandal, but basically the merrymaking goes on. If the anti-war movement is to be a real anti-war movement, and it's up to us to make an effort to do so, it must link the struggle for peace and against war with the struggle for socialism. Because there can be no end to war unless and until you work for socialism. And we have to make clear that the only way war can come to an end is by ending the division of society into classes, into exploiters and the exploited. In the words of Lenin, it's impossible to escape the imperialist war and imperialist peace, which inevitably engenders imperialist war. It's impossible to escape that inferno except by a Bolshevik struggle and a Bolshevik revolution. And therefore, really, for us, it's the weapon of Marxism-Leninism and the trail blazed by the great October Socialist Revolution, which alone can extricate humanity from the inferno created by imperialism and imperialist wars. And it doesn't really matter what the difficulties are. In the end, that is what will have to happen. Imperialism is actually putting the fate of human civilization at stake. And if this war is not followed by revolution, there will be other wars. The whole old fable, this being the last war, is nothing but a fable. It's a fairy tale. People have said after each war, that's it, no more. After the Second World War, saying, that's it, we shall have no wars. No, that's not the case. Unless you eliminate the source of war, there's no way that war will come to an end. And the source of war is the division of society into classes. It is imperialism. And unless we get rid of imperialism, then there can be no end to war. As a part of fighting against imperialism, as a part of fighting for socialism, we have got to fight against opportunism. We've got to fight against opportunist distortions on the question of war, as indeed on every other question. Some of these distortions are very simple. One distortion is imperialism is really peaceful by nature. That's what Kautsky propagated, believe it or not, and that's what Khrushchev propagated. And it's actually sowing illusions among the people as to the nature of imperialism, portraying it as in bright, peaceful colors when it's bloodthirsty and warmongering every minute and every breath of its existence. The other one that comes with it is, yes, you admit imperialism means war, but we mustn't do anything to start a war, because any war will turn into a nuclear war, and it will annihilate. May I have some water?
Yeah.
And it will annihilate humanity. Khrushchev, for example, on the one hand said war can be eliminated while imperialism still lasts, imperialism peaceful. On other occasions, he said, this system breeds war, but we must avoid war, because there will be no victors. Nuclear weapons have abolished the distinction between just and unjust wars. And to use Khrushchev's words, if war takes place, yes, capitalism will fall, that's for sure, but who will be the winners? The whole of humanity will be destroyed. We cannot build communist civilization on the ruins of ancient culture And on Noah's Ark, this planet would simply not exist. American imperialism has been able to prolong its existence since the Second World War through intimidation by nuclear weapons. What actually kept the peace between nations for a very long time was that within 4 years, of American dropping atom bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which bombs, can I have my own glass, she got some disease. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. That these bombs were not dropped to secure Japan's surrender. Japan was ready to surrender. They were done for two purposes. One, under the agreements between the Allied powers, the Soviet Union was to take part, after the end of the war in Europe, in the liberation of Japan. The Americans, once they had acquired the atom bomb, did not want the Soviet Union to be a participant in the liberation of Japan. They'd already seen what happened in Europe. The Red Army fought single-handedly against the Nazi Wehrmacht. Out of Hitler's 350 divisions, 300 were fighting on the Eastern Front, and if the Soviet Red Army that beat the hell out of them, that tore the guts out of the Nazi war machine. And they had liberated Soviet Russia, come through Poland, all the way to Berlin. A German soldier, once they started retreating from Moscow, wrote graffiti on a wall 25 kilometers outside of Moscow, because they never were able to reach Moscow. We're off to Berlin. And a Soviet soldier came and put a rejoinder, we'll see you in Berlin. Yeah. So they reached Berlin. That's where the two armies met. That's why you had the peculiar position of Berlin. East Berlin was occupied by the Soviet forces, West Berlin by the Americans and the British. And so eventually when the settlement came, you had East Berlin and West Berlin within the territory of the former GDR. It became a center of subversion, but that is what the Americans did not want to see, this nightmare repeated in Asia as well. So they dropped the bomb so they'll secure on their own the surrender of Japan. Secondly, Soviet Union didn't have those weapons. It was a warning to Soviet Union that if the Soviet Union did not behave, that's what will happen to the Soviet Union. And at the Potsdam Conference, Truman informed Stalin, said, Mr. Stalin, we have got a bomb of terrible destructive power. The Soviet Union already knew it through its agents, that the Americans had been successful in their Manhattan project. So Stalin, without batting an eyelid, said, thank you for informing me, went away, and called his Minister of Heavy Industry and said, we must have a socialist bomb, and pretty soon too. And about the same time as China achieved its liberation on the 1st of October 1949, while Chairman Mao was announcing from Tiananmen Square, the Chinese people have stood up, Soviet Russia exploded its first atomic bomb. These were really two atomic bombs unleashed on Uncle Sam and shook the imperialist world to its very foundation. And if peace was kept in Europe, it was precisely because of the Soviet weapons. Weapons don't fire themselves. As Engels in his controversy with Düring said, even in our days, guns do not fire themselves. Somebody's got to pull the trigger. And it's not the weapons that cause wars. It's the class that has control of these weapons. It's not knives that kill spouses. It's one of the spouses who uses it, right? We can't ban knives just because there have been some lunatics where they do each other to death, right? So we are saying, as far as nuclear disarmament is concerned, we are in favor of universal, non-discriminatory nuclear disarmament. Everybody disarm. Until such time as that happens, every country has, and a lot of socialists don't like this idea because socialists are so much saturated with the propaganda of pacifism. At a conference of communists in Brussels, I made this point. I even went on to stress my point in my own funny way. I said, if I had the resources, I'd like to install some nuclear weapons in my back garden. Anybody giving me trouble, they should know what will happen to them. So we're not really opposed to anybody having nuclear weapons, as long as the main imperialist powers are armed to the hilt. They are arming themselves with more and more sophisticated weapons, and they're trying to deprive all the oppressed people of the ability even to have nuclear energy for civilian purposes, as in the case of Iran. Iran has no nuclear weapons. It has no intention of nuclear weapons. It has declared that it never will produce. It has even said it's against Islam to have nuclear weapons. I don't know what the Quran has to say on nuclear weapons. But anyway, their interpretation is that if Muhammad was writing it today, he would say nuclear weapons are not what we want, right? But they say it's un-Islamic to have nuclear weapons. I don't care whether it's un-Islamic or not. The fact of the matter is Iran has no nuclear weapons, does not wish to produce nuclear weapons. So a war is waged against Iran, economic war, and it's threatened with an actual military invasion because it would not pursue a policy that is to the liking of imperialism. Next door, less than 1,000 miles away, there is a country that has got 200 nuclear weapons. The only country in the Middle East that has nuclear weapons. Yeah. That's the Zionist state of Israel. Do you ever hear any threats against Israel from America, Britain, France? No, you do not. So it's not a question of whether the nuclear weapons should be banned. We are in favor of it. North Korea has probably half a dozen nuclear weapons. And there is such a lot of propaganda against the DPRK that it's a dreadful state, it's got nuclear weapons. In 2/3 of their country, which is occupied by US imperialism, which US imperialism has no reason to occupy. America has 1,000 nuclear weapons and 30,000 American troops that occupy the southern portion of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Somebody comes to your house, occupies 2/3 your house, brings the most sophisticated weaponry to keep occupying that house, and then tells you you cannot even bring a shotgun into your house because you're threatening. That's the logic of imperialism, and therefore imperialism can only be dealt with by the language of violence. They don't understand logic. They don't understand any reasoning. You know, if the thing could be done in the debating chamber of the Oxford University Union, the Koreans would be happy to do that and resolve the contradiction. There'd be no argument against that. But that's not how it's done. If the world of power politics, imperialism says, you're rich, you're poor, you're weak, we can invade you and we can occupy you. But if they know there are consequences of occupation, if they know there are consequences of committing aggression, they think twice. If they haven't invaded since the armistice of July 1953 on the Korean Peninsula, if they haven't invaded the northern part of the Korean Peninsula, it is basically because the Koreans will give a very good account of themselves, as they did in the war between 50 and 53. So we are definitely not going to be intimidated by anybody's nuclear weapons. As Paul said, war is horrible, it's destructive of material wealth and of human life. We are not in favor of wasting either of them. But we're not frightened of war. People cannot prevent us from pursuing revolutionary politics. They cannot prevent countries from pursuing independent politics by threatening them with nuclear weapons. People have, in the final analysis, people will overpower and overwhelm nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons cannot overwhelm humanity. The other thing is that as far as war is concerned, weapons are important, but there is such a thing as a spiritual condition of the people fighting war as well. If weapons always counted, you could never win a war against imperialism. The ruled class, whether it's the bourgeoisie rising against feudalism or the working class against the bourgeoisie, could never win because the ruling class always got far greater control of far more sophisticated weaponry. Whether it's bows and arrows, whether it's guns of the old type, right? Whether it is self-loading rifles, or whether it is tanks and modern artillery, whatever it is. The ruling class is in control of much more of that. But yet they can be overwhelmed because it's really the justness of the war that makes people fight, which actually is responsible for final victory. As Lenin pointed out, in every war, victory is conditioned in the final analysis by the spiritual state of the masses who shed their blood on the field of battle. Conviction of the justness of the war, the consciousness of the necessity to sacrifice their lives for the good of their brothers, raises the spirits of the soldiers and makes them endure unheard of burdens. The Tsarist generals say that our Red Army men endure such hardships as the army of the Tsarist system could never have been able to endure. This is explained by the fact that every worker and peasant placed under arms knows what he's fighting for, and consciously sheds his blood in the name of the triumph of justice and socialism. Could the Vietnamese, without that sense of justness of their war, have won against Americans? They sprayed them with napalm, the consequence of which the Vietnamese people are still suffering today, with hundreds of people, children born deformed, their vast areas of land being contaminated with Agent Orange. These are the people who have the cheek to say the Assad regime used chemical weapons. They've sprayed the whole country of Vietnam with these weapons, and they've been using depleted uranium as a part of their weapons in Iraq. So, in the end, people win because they see the justness of their cause and they fight. They put everything into doing that. The other thing that happens under the conditions of imperialism is the more the ruling class becomes aggressive, the more the contradiction between the force of production and the narrow relation of production develops, the more the hypocrisy of the policy of the ruling classes. In the words of Chairman Mao, they practice priest-like deception hand in hand with butcher-like suppression. Marx, Plekhanov once shrewdly remarked, Marx said very truly that the greater the development of antagonism between the growing forces of production and the existing social order, the more does the ideology of the ruling class become permeated with hypocrisy. In addition, the more effectively life unveils the mendacious character of this ideology, the more does the language used by the dominant class become sublime and virtuous. You see, imperialism, while waging the most horrendous, brutal wars, Nazi-like wars, constantly talks about concern for human rights, democracy, freedom, rights of women, rights of children. You know, a child dies every 2 seconds because of malnutrition in the world. That is the price that imperialism extracts from human beings. And they'll tell you they're trying to save the children. The position of women in Afghanistan has not improved one jot since the American invasion and invasion by Britain of that country. The production of heroin hasn't declined. Actually, it has increased 30 times since the invasion. I think it wouldn't be surprising if a lot of our soldiers returned heroin addicts from there, because you live in horrible conditions, you kill other people, you are frightened of the mere rustling of the leaves, you're frightened of your own shadows in a foreign land where you're out to kill people. Drugs are obviously a bit of a diversion from that. So every indices of human development is down in Afghanistan, as it is in Iraq. I knew Iraq before the American and British aggression against that country. It was a wonderful country. It had a terrific infrastructure, an educated and cultured public, and the standard of living was equivalent to that of the southern European countries of Spain, Portugal, etc. And it's a totally gutted country. A country that produces so much energy cannot supply electricity to its own people now. This is because America has brought democracy, human rights, got rid of tyranny of Saddam Hussein, and everything is wonderful there. The final section of my conversation with you today is that we can do these things, we can fight against imperialism, but there is one thing that we have got to do along with that, without which we cannot fight against imperialism. We've got to fight against opportunism in the working class movement itself. Now, what is opportunism in the working class movement? And what is its economic basis? Opportunism in the working class movement is basically where a section of the working class joins its own ruling class to fight against the workers of other countries or the oppressed people in other countries. What is the phenomena of opportunism, and why is opportunism so predominant in the imperialist countries? The economic basis of opportunism is that the bourgeoisie of the imperialist countries not only exploits its own working class, which of course it does, it is its birthright to do so, it also exploits people all over the world, the vast masses of people in Asia, Africa and Latin America, who are super exploited, and out of the exploitation of these foreign workers, it is able to set aside, and does set aside, a portion, which may be a small proportion of the bourgeoisie's income, but is a large enough sum for bribing upper sections of its own working class to create a social base for its existence. And that, of course, turns these people towards social peace. It turns them against their own working class, against the oppressed people abroad, in favor of the bourgeoisie. Lenin dealt with this question, and he explained that this upper stratum of bourgeoisified workers, thoroughly petty bourgeois in their lifestyle, in the size of their incomes and their world outlook, serve as the principal social prop of the bourgeoisie, the real agents of the bourgeoisie in the working class movement, the labor lieutenants of the capitalist class, real vehicles of reformism and chauvinism. In the civil war between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, they inevitably, and in no small numbers, take the side of the bourgeoisie, the Versailles against the communards. This is a reference to the reactionary and revolutionary forces in the 1870s in France. And Lenin adds, unless the economic roots of this phenomenon are understood and its political and social significance is appreciated, not a step can be taken towards the solution of practical problems of the communist movement and of the impending social revolution. Now this is a question really which is not dealt head-on by revolutionaries in the imperialist countries. Basically, they do not want to annoy their own labor aristocrats. They want to be on good terms with them. And they can't bear the thought that somehow the working class could ever take part in this bribery and loot. But Lenin was quite open, whether he was talking about the Russian labor aristocracy or in Western Europe. And his answer was, how was it the persistence of opportunism in Europe to be explained? And this is what he says, because the advanced countries have been creating their culture by the opportunity they've had of living at the expense of 1 billion oppressed people, because the imperialists of all countries obtain a great deal more than they would have been able to obtain in the shape of profits resulting from the robbery of workers in their own countries. And he comes to that question again and again and again. And we have got to say that this is the case. We have these arguments. Elle and I often go to international conferences and we argue with American and Belgian comrades. And they say, no, it can't be right. And last time we argued with an American comrade. He came to see us and we started our meeting at about 10 at night and it carried until 3 or 3:30 in the morning. He had absolutely no arguments against it, so I then said to him, I said, Mick, I think your punishment is over. You can go and come back for it next year and we'll repeat the experience. Because unless actually you understand that, you cannot develop a working class movement. Because opportunists have a political representation as well. I don't know about other countries, but in Western Europe, and particularly in Britain, the political representative of this bribed section, this labor aristocracy, is social democracy, which we in this country call the Labour Party. And that is why it's not because of some lunacy and some disease that our comrades are to be seen at demonstrations shouting, break the link, i.e. the trade unions and the labour movement must break its link with the Labour Party. Because as long as they continue to be tied to its apron strings, they'll continue to be tied to the system of exploitation and the system of war waged by our bourgeoisie. And we therefore say that we must break the link. Now our opponents say the Labour Party is a mass party of the working class. Well, Lenin's answer was like this. In the 19th century, the mass organizations of English trade unions were on the side of the bourgeois Labour Party. Marx and Engels did not reconcile themselves to this on that ground. They exposed it. In the 19th century, at the time of Marx, most of the trade unions were confined to skilled workers' unions. The unskilled workers did not actually start being recruited till the beginning of the 1890s, gas workers' union, etc. And not much came of it straight away. But Marx and Engels constantly exposed the leadership of the trade unions as bourgeois and said, well, they were constantly siding with their bourgeoisie. And Engels even went so far to say that in England, they were trying to create, alongside the bourgeoisie, a bourgeois aristocracy and a bourgeois working class movement. And Engels said for a country that had the monopoly of the world market and a monopoly of colonies, this was to a certain extent understandable. Because in England, the conditions of what we call imperialism, the concentration of capital, development of monopoly, monopoly of the world market, monopoly of colonies, were present there before proper imperialism comes at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of 20th century. Precisely for that reason, after the defeat of the Chartist movement, the British bourgeoisie was able to better the conditions of existence, not only of the top sections of the working class, but even of ordinary workers considerably. Precisely for that reason, since the death of Chartism, no working class party arose in Britain until the formation of the Independent Labour Party. So you have 4 decades when there is no working class organization. Britain is the only country in Europe which had no working class party. And the working class basically acted as the left wing of the great liberal party. They stood on the... And whenever you tried to put forward the policy of breaking the link with liberals, there were people like the CPB, the NCP, who came and said, you want the Tories to win. Why do you want to break a link between the working class and the liberals? Because if the liberals lose, Tories will win. Well, that argument was seen through. Labour Party did develop and replace the liberals, if you like. And we are saying exactly the same now. The mass organizations, as long as they're aligned with the Labour Party, actually have to be exposed. We have to say where they stand. Can you just believe that all these unions pay millions every year to the Labour Party? The Labour Party is bankrupt without them. And they all try to say, oh no, we don't influence the Labour Party's policy. Why not? If the city financiers give money, they want to see a return for their money. If the working class is paying, if you pay for the CPGBML to be a functioning organization, you have a right to demand that it pursue policies which are in the interest of the working class. And not pretend, oh no, we don't interfere in these things. This is just decided by Ella and Paul and nobody else dare to ask any question. No, we should on the contrary say, if they want our money, we are the payers, and we must tell the piper what tune to play. And of course, if you can't do that, you haven't got any control of it. The other people will say to us is, Labour Party has workers in it. Well, so did the Nazis. You think the Nazi party was a mass party without some workers being in it? But Lenin answered this question exactly at the same time as he was telling the communists to apply to affiliate themselves to the Labour Party. I had a reason for it. He says, nobody's listening to you because you're such a small wing of the Labour movement. Labour Party has masses of workers in it. It did used to have workers at that time. It has no workers now, by the way. The workers have left the Labour Party. There's no individual, there's trade union membership. But the Labour Party, if you look at the composition of the Labour Party, it's all professionals. They're not real, what you call, workers in it. They might be in the Marxist definition, proletarian or petty bourgeois, but they are not really workers as you and I would understand. They are professionals, they are middle managers, and most of the lawyers, that's on the Blairites, people who are out to make a career. But even if they were workers, this was Lenin's answer. Of course, the bulk of the members of the Labour Party are workers. He said in answer to a question, it's a proletarian party. However, whether a party is really a political party of the workers or not depends not only upon whether it consists of workers, but also upon who leads it, upon the content of its activities and of its political tactics. Only the latter determines whether we have before us a really political party of the proletariat. From this point of view, the only correct one, the Labour Party is a thoroughly bourgeois party, because although it consists of workers, it is led by reactionaries, and the worst reactionaries at that, who act in the spirit of the bourgeoisie. It is an organisation of the bourgeoisie which exists systematically to dupe the workers with the aid of British Nazis and Scheidemans, these are German opportunists. So you have to look at the political physiognomy of a party, its policy, who leads, etc. You can't simply say there are workers in the party, and this is the only line to take in the labour movement, which is to explain to the masses the necessity and inevitability of breaking the link with the opportunists, to actually have nothing to do with the opportunists, to expose them. When Lenin was saying to the communists affiliate to the Labour Party, he was at the same time saying, go there, and by going there, you must have the freedom of propaganda. You must be able to point out MacDonald and Henderson are traitors to the working class. And you must win over the workers by saying that. Well, Lenin's speech was read more avidly and more intelligently by the Labour Party than it was read by the communists. Precisely for that reason, the Labour Party reorganized itself and prevented the communists from affiliating. Before that, before the Labour Party's constitution that came in the aftermath of the First World War, all socialist organizations could affiliate to the Labour Party. In fact, the largest constituent of the future Communist Party, what was it? The Socialist?
British Socialist Party.
British Socialist Party used to be affiliated to the Labour Party. But the moment it became part of the Communist Party, it became a completely different thing. And the Labour Party never accepted the application for affiliation to the Labour Party. And yet there are mummies, dead people who call themselves revolutionaries, who actually say our party is trying to affiliate to the Labour Party. The more they are dropping dead, the more they are clamoring, say they will affiliate to the Labour Party. The Labour Party will not accept this affiliation. So our job is to explain to people war is inevitable under capitalism. Secondly, that war is not an aberration, it's normal business under capitalism. It's not something extraordinary, it's not something that happens by mistake, that people sleepwalk into war, as one of the books recently brought out says, sleepwalkers, there was no need to have a First World War, they just sleepwalked into it. The war had been in preparation for a very long time. They had concluded secret treaties for the carving out of countries, which the Bolsheviks published after the Bolshevik Revolution. It was a war for really fighting for interest. And war cannot be eliminated as long as capitalism lasts. And to fight against war, we must link the struggle of the fight for peace with the struggle for socialism. And to do all that, we must fight against opportunism, and we must break the link with labor. Thank you for listening to me.